If you thought global diplomacy had settled into predictable patterns, the first week of December 2025 proved just how wildly wrong that assumption can be. Because within the span of only 48 hours, on the 3rd and the 4th, two world leaders made two visits to two rival superpowers, and the international order suddenly looked less like a chessboard and more like a suspense script no one had rehearsed for. Emmanuel Macron showed up in Beijing while Vladimir Putin landed in New Delhi. And the timing was so perfectly dramatic that even seasoned analysts had to pause and ask whether they were still watching geopolitics or a cleverly stitched political thriller. And no, this was not a coincidence. It was a calculated move from every angle. A moment where the world's power centers all flexed at the same time, revealing just how aggressively each of them is trying to reshape what the next global order will look like. The story really begins with Europe, or more precisely, Europe's growing frustration. For months, European leaders and media outlets have been almost theatrically vocal in their criticism of President Donald Trump's proposed peace plan for Ukraine. To them, the plan isn't just flawed, it is openly indulgent toward Moscow. They see it as a peace deal, written on terms that weaken Europe's long-term strategy, undermine its unity, and reward Russia at precisely the moment Europe believes punishment is most necessary. And of course, there is the emotional sting. Europe has spent tens of billions supporting Kyiv, pouring resources into military, economic, and humanitarian aid. Now, many in Europe feel they are being shoved off the negotiating table, while Washington negotiates its own future with Moscow. The feeling of being sidelined has hardened into something deeper: strategic resentment. Out of this resentment emerged a quiet but unmistakable shift in thinking. If Europe cannot rely on Washington to define the future of Ukraine, then perhaps Europe must find another global heavyweight capable of influencing Moscow. And that heavyweight is China. It is an uncomfortable truth for many in the West, but Emmanuel Macron has long championed the idea of strategic autonomy, the belief that Europe must be strong and independent enough to chart its own course. So when he boarded his plane to Beijing on December 3rd, he wasn't just making another diplomatic trip. He was trying to pull China into Europe's orbit, or at least convince Beijing to nudge Moscow toward concessions that Europe has been unable to secure. Beijing welcomed Macron with carefully measured warmth, the type of warmth that feels polite but never quite promises anything. Macron, however, came prepared, bringing along 6 ministers and 35 top executives. The size of his delegation said what official speeches could not. Europe was not only seeking peace, it was seeking a long-term strategic relationship. French officials spoke openly about China's potential role in guiding Russia toward what they called the right decisions, a phrase that sounds diplomatic on the surface, but carries a very clear subtext. This was France attempting to Europeanize the peace process by bringing in a non-Western giant, a dramatic attempt to reset global dynamics and prove that Europe could shape outcomes even when Washington stepped aside. But while Macron was being photographed in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, another arrival on another continent was generating even more buzz. On December 4th, Vladimir Putin's plane touched down in New Delhi, and something extraordinary happened the moment he stepped off the aircraft. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a leader known for strict protocol, broke all convention. He stood waiting on the tarmac, embraced Putin warmly, and then guided him toward a white Toyota Fortuner. Not a German Mercedes, not a British Range Rover, not even the Russian Urus Senat that followed behind in the convoy, a Japanese-branded India-assembled Toyota SUV. And suddenly, an ordinary car became the most dissected diplomatic symbol of the month. Analysts quickly understood why. Using a British or German luxury vehicle would have been a minefield. Those nations have been among the loudest critics of Russia and architects of the harshest sanctions. Driving Putin around in their cars would have signaled dependence on the very countries that have condemned Moscow the most. The Toyota Fortuner solved that problem elegantly. Japan has criticized Russia, yes, but far more softly than Europe. And this model is built locally in India, aligning perfectly with Modi's Make in India campaign. In one practical choice, India avoided offending Europe, respected its own industrial policies, and showed that it is fully capable of playing the geopolitical game on its own terms. Then, in a detail that feels almost comedic given the gravity of the visit, an official later revealed that Modi's Range Rover didn't have enough seats for both leaders and their interpreters. The Fortuner, with its 3 rows, did. And just like that, global diplomacy briefly hinged on seat configuration. But behind the humor lies a deeper truth. India wanted the world to see its autonomy, not as a slogan, but as an act. Riding with Putin was a symbolic reaffirmation of a partnership Indian officials later described as one of the most stable relationships of the modern era. For Russia, the timing was ideal. Only months earlier, President Trump had slapped a 50% tariff on most Indian exports, widely seen as a punishment for India's continued purchase of discounted Russian oil. New Delhi kept buying anyway. Moscow kept selling. India saved billions. Russia gained an alternative market after losing Europe. Both sides walked away stronger than before. The Kremlin's reaction to the US tariffs was almost dismissive. Dmitry Peskov stated plainly that Russia wasn't worried about the tariffs at all, that what truly mattered was expanding trade with India and making sure no external power interfered. It was a remark crafted with icy precision, a message designed to resonate far beyond Washington or New Delhi. When the dust from both trips began to settle, analysts started connecting the dots. Macron's China visit and Putin's India visit were not separate stories. They were 2 sides of the same evolving global landscape. Europe, feeling neglected by Washington, reached out to Beijing in search of influence. Russia, under sanctions and pressure, looked to India for economic survival and diplomatic legitimacy. India embraced its role as a rising power capable of choosing its partners freely. And China positioned itself as the indispensable pivot in the new geopolitical triangle. Not fully aligned with Russia or Europe, but powerful enough that both sides needed its cooperation. This is what makes the events of December 3rd and 4th so remarkable. 4 major powers, France, China, Russia, and India, all revealed their long-term strategic instincts within 2 days. Europe signaled its desire for autonomy from the United States. China showcased its centrality. India declared its independence. Russia reinforced its partnerships. And the United States, intentionally or not, ended up pushing other powers toward recalibrating their alliances. If this is what 2 days look like, imagine the next decade. The world is no longer moving along predictable east-west lines. It is twisting, overlapping, reshaping itself into patterns that defy the alliances of the past. Europe is beginning to question its reliance on Washington. India is emerging as a power that answers to no one. Russia is building a lifeline outside its traditional spheres, and China is becoming the gravitational center that every major player must account for. And now the real question, the question only time can answer, is whether we are witnessing the beginning of a more balanced multipolar system, or simply the early tremors of a deeper, more chaotic global fragmentation. So I'll leave you with this. In this unfolding drama of power, strategy, and shifting loyalties, which nation do you believe is playing the smartest long game? France, China, Russia, or India? Share your thoughts, because the next chapter of this story hasn't been written yet, and the world is already waiting to see where these 4 giants move next.